Hello and welcome back to the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. My name is Tommy Wood and I am joined as ever by my very balanced co-host, Dr. Josh Turknett. Say hello, Josh.
Hello, Tommy.
And really excited today to have a former colleague and good friend of mine, the regenerative Dr. James Hewitt. Hello, James. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, hi, guys. It's great to be here.
So we are bringing James on partly because he's got a book out this week that we're very excited to hear about. But in general, I think the work that you do, James, is super helpful for us, as well as will be very helpful for all of our listeners. You've been, really kind of forging new fields of trying to improve performance in the knowledge work environment and have people show up and be able to work at their best without, leading to burnout and all these other things that we're so increasingly familiar with, which I think is a good thing. But just to kind of get us started, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the genesis of your work. And I think a question that Josh has that maybe we can use to kind of kick this off is you're obviously well known in the leadership and business world now, but were formerly an athlete. So how did you kind of get into this? Was it more a focus on athletes or business or both? How did you kind of get into this world?
Well, it was all a focus on sport at the beginning, and not just one sport specifically, road racing, cycling, and actually my performance, not other people's. So this all really began for me when I was in my teens. I discovered road cycling, and I was enamored by the idea that you could hit speeds of 100 kilometers an hour on tires a few centimeters thick before my prefrontal cortex was fully developed. I had a full sense of what I was doing. I mean, it was a crazy time if you think about it. This was the early 2000s. And during that time, this is where you used to train without wearing helmets. I remember I moved to the south of France to pursue this dream of becoming a professional cyclist. And rocked up in this little village called Limoux, and one of my first training rides, kind of trotted downstairs with my new kit, feeling all excited, with my helmet on like a good boy. And one of my teammates kind of said, Pedicast, we don't wear helmets in training, only for racing, because of course you never have head injuries in training, right?
Yeah, of course.
So anyway, it was a really incredible experience. I got to race full time for several years. I even won a few races. Unfortunately, my cycling career didn't reach the heights that I hoped for. But that time embedded, you could almost think of it as an algorithm in my mind, this idea that effort plus optimization equals peak performance.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I decided to retire from racing because I wasn't good enough, I went back to university in the UK. I studied sports science. Eventually, I set up a coaching business, which is what you do when you're a failed athlete, right? And I know that's not true for every coach, but that was true for me. It was like plan B. And initially, my idea was that I was going to work with elite and professional riders. And I worked with a small number, but I found that the people who had the most enthusiasm for coaching, and perhaps most importantly at that point in my life, the highest willingness to pay, were amateur cyclists. This was still when Lance Armstrong was the be-all and end-all. He was the icon for a particular archetype of amateur road cyclist who worked for 80 hours during the week in London, where we were based at the time, and decided that they wanted to go and race 180 kilometers every weekend. And so I started to work with these people, and initially completely focused on their physical performance, but very quickly came to realize that unless I could find a way to incorporate the load associated with their working life, I couldn't plan their physical training effectively. And this was just by observation, because I could see that when people had big weeks at work, a lot of stress. I worked with a lot of financial professionals, and you could almost track a kind of deal cycle relative to the physical load they could tolerate. And so, for example, a session which they could tolerate perfectly well in lower intensity work periods suddenly became overwhelming. And so this led me to try and incorporate this notion of the load associated with knowledge work, this cognitive load, also the psychological load, from the stress associated with their lives. And as I was looking around, I felt that there weren't really many tools available. Training Peaks, the primary platform I was using at that time, didn't really have a metric at that point for the perception of effort. That wasn't available at that point. And I'd used heart rate variability a bit. This was back when there were some rudimentary smartphone apps, but you basically needed to wear a polar strap in the morning, lying in bed to take a heart rate variability measurement, but started to recognize that there were these correlations between load in their working life, load on their bike, and started to get increasingly curious about how you could actually measure this load in the workplace. And it intrigued me because it was abstract, because it was complex. And I started to develop this question in my mind: can we quantify knowledge work with the same level of acuity, same level of definition and precision that we can measure physical load? As it turns out, we can't. It's too abstract. But there are ways that we can get towards that. And one of the ways that I did this was to come up with this heuristic of approaching knowledge work like a cognitive endurance activity. Now, my journey has really developed a lot since then. And actually my thinking, some of my philosophy, maybe even the values behind how I approach knowledge work and thinking about supporting sustained performance in the workplace has changed a lot, even from the time that Tommy, you and I first got to know each other. Some of that relates to my own experience along the way, and perhaps recognizing as well that we can't measure things quite as accurately as we might like to, that some of the subjective psychological stuff that I tried to avoid for so long actually had an enormous impact, perhaps bigger than we would ever like to admit at times. But still, this question of how do we balance these different aspects of our life, work, our aspirations physically, our personal and social lives, support sustained performance, support health span, perhaps most importantly, has really guided me. And that led me to do a PhD looking at the workplace specifically, and this notion of sustained performance in knowledge work, but from a very multimodal perspective. So looking at psychological, behavioral, physiological measures and trying to build up this picture of what might be supporting or inhibiting sustained performance in the workplace. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a potted history and where we're at today. Yeah, I'm happy to take that wherever you want to in terms of what we talk about next.
Great. Thanks very much. So you're talking about sort of seeing this out in the real world, but it aligns very nicely with obviously Bruce McEwen's idea of allostatic load, right? Although a lot of his work was done in rats and was quite theoretical, at least, but you're sort of seeing it out in the real world and figuring out how we can navigate that ourselves. I'm interested to hear about the sort of what you've learned over the years, or what has maybe changed over the last few years as you've done more and more of this. But at the same time, maybe you could tell us about what you've seen change in the business world, because we've obviously become much more acutely aware of burnout and mental health, and that's something that's often on the tip of people's tongues nowadays. But are we actually changing things, or are we just playing lip service to it? Like, how are all those different factors interacting from what you see, sort of actually applying this stuff out in the real world?
So I think this idea of the cognitive athlete has been around for a long time now. It was first described in a Harvard Business Review article like years and years ago. So this idea that there's maybe some lessons from endurance sport or the athletic world that apply to the workplace precedes anything that I've been talking about. But that really did inspire a lot of my thinking early on. And it always felt that there was a portion of people that really resonated with this idea that they were an athlete pursuing goals, measuring, improving along the way. I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen is that mindset has just grown and really proliferated across the business world. And so this idea that we are high performers and we want to aspire to high performance, you could almost say it's been democratized, and the whole ecosystem of products and services and content has really grown up around that. So the biggest change that I think now is that back when I started talking about this 10, 15 years ago, if I was talking about heart rate variability, for example, maybe one person in the audience might have heard of that, if you're lucky. So many people have heard about it now. And that's not just in kind of dominant markets like the US. I'm increasingly speaking in the Middle East as well. And traditionally, the Middle East had this reputation of being a bit behind in this kind of well-being and human performance topic. But I did an event there a few weeks ago to a group of high potentials in a global corporation, and they were all incredibly aware and fully up to date with kind of thinking, products, services, questions related to these topics. So one of the biggest changes I've seen is just this growth of awareness and knowledge, and this idea of what human performance means in the context of the workplace, in the context of personal fitness, But I don't think that has been entirely positive. And I think one of the challenges that I've seen is that it has birthed what I describe as the cult of hyper optimization.
Yeah.
And so there's a number of challenges to this, but I think one of the biggest challenges is it's led to a kind of, you might call it a materialistic reductionism, where there's this belief that you can measure everything,
Mm-hmm.
that measurement represents truth, and that measurement and quantification can inevitably lead to optimization and improvement, and that is a good idea. And so I've gone from a place where no one knows about heart rate variability, where now people are absolutely obsessing over it,
Yeah.
and it's guiding their decision making way beyond the validity and the reliability of that measurement, particularly as it pertains to some wearable devices that they're using. That's a whole other conversation, right? But not only is it now heart rate variability, it's the supplement protocols, it's the morning routines. And a lot of this I see has been kind of driven by what feels like a kind of hijacking of scientific languages, scientific language and vocabulary for the purpose of promoting personalities, products, and protocols. If I'm going to be really, really blunt.
Beautiful.
I think the most pernicious, let's just get on with the alliteration here, start writing, can't you? The most pernicious of these challenges, I think, relates to the hijacking of some cognitive biases that often I don't think we're really aware of. And I just see now we've gone from the state of kind of unawareness of these topics to unawareness of how often we're being misled and led astray. And there's this kind of trifecta of cognitive biases that I see that start with biological plausibility bias. And again, this relates to what I describe as this materialistic reductionism, where people say A leads to B, B leads to C, therefore A must lead to C.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps, to make that concrete, probably the best example of that relates to a lot of the promotion around deliberate cold water immersion or cold exposure.
Yeah.
Now, let me just get this out there. I'm not fundamentally against this idea, but I've lost count of the number of people when I talk about sustained high performance in the workplace. I get a question about cold water immersion. And sometimes it goes along the track of, well, we all know that cold water increases dopamine, right? And we all know that dopamine increases motivation, right? So when I jump in cold water, my motivation increases and I feel amazing. But and they'll quote some studies which have been widely promoted. But what they don't account for is that dopamine increase was in plasma, not in the brain, where it increases urine output and shivering. And actually, no one's done any kind of study directly in the brain of a human, looking at kind of whether cold water immersion increases dopamine directly in the brain and whether or not that increases aspects of cognition. And in fact, a lot of the literature indicates that cold water immersion probably suppresses aspects of cognitive performance afterwards. But anyway, that's just one idea, one example of this biological plausibility bias. But then you add in this seductive allure of neuroscientific explanations. And that's been researched. It's a phenomena, there's an acronym SANE for it, where essentially you can pretty much say anything. And if you chuck in a few neuroscientific terms, and even better, a completely irrelevant but very interesting looking brain scan, and people rate what you say as much more credible and as much more as likely a better explanation. And the third one is precision bias. So you then chuck in a very specific number, increases brain dopamine by 250%, even though it's not brain dopamine, whatever. That's just one example of that. And I just see this now everywhere. So there's a whole group of people now who are convinced that we are at the pinnacle of scientific understanding with all these protocols, with all these products, with people espousing all these very convincing sounding ideas. And the problem is that you've now got this group of people who are essentially bifurcating into two groups, which I would describe as the hyper optimizers or the disengaged, some might say quiet quitters. And often people oscillate between the two because they watch they listen to a podcast, they come across an idea on social media, and they're like, right, I'm going to start this new protocol because it's going to boost this cocktail of neurotransmitters and transform my life. And they're spending an hour doing that every day for a week or two or maybe a month. And suddenly they're like, wow, this just doesn't work with real life. They encounter resistance, they give up, they get disengaged until the next new idea comes along.
Mhm.
And so my frustration really in this space now is that as much as I'm happy that people are starting to have these conversations about how we can sustain high performance, I feel like we can't see the wood for the trees, and we're just getting distracted by all these different ideas that sound really convincing. Where actually, this what I describe as the third way that avoids the extremes of the hyper optimization or the quiet quitting. And unfortunately, those practices are the things that work, but they're not that compelling and interesting sometimes to talk about compared with all these great ideas. So thank you for everyone for coming to my TED talk.
I think
My rant is over.
like you're definitely preaching to the converted here. Like all of this is stuff that
that was brilliant.
And we've noted this too. And like, so I just finished writing a book as well, and I didn't put a single percentage or number in terms of this thing increase for that reason. Like we just don't. It will shift you in one direction or the other, but like this precision bias is a big issue, as well as everything else that you mentioned. And I think it's really important to cover that. So then, like, how do you navigate that? Like, I've seen you stroll onto a stage wearing what I believe was an Epoch X, like emotive Epoch X EEG headset, and you're showing people your brainwaves, and that's obviously very compelling. So how do you then break down those two different responses, both to the idea of improving performance as well as just like the knowledge work environment in general, so that people can sort of find and engage with this like middle way of yours?
Well, and that's been leveled at me before, because it's like on one hand I'm talking about the kind of the potential for the seductive allure of neuroscientific explanations to influence people and maybe even manipulate. And then I'm like prancing about on stage wearing an EEG headset, showing people a kind of artistic representation of my rotating brain. So, it's like take the plank out of my own eye, right? But I think my perspective on this is, if you want to communicate, you need a combination of factors. And actually, I think that the old principles of rhetoric still endure. That we need this ethos, pathos, and logos, right? So we need this ethos, this credibility. We need the pathos, this kind of emotional connection. And then the logos, a logical argument. And the thing about the kind of the EEG headset is that it does inspire some emotion, particularly people's kind of interest and curiosity and excitement. It's something different. And we live in such a noisy world. You've got to do something to cut through. Okay. Now, I do actually, I think it's what I do with the headset on stage, I think it's defensible. And I'm very clear that the rotating model that I show, that basically visualizes a spectrum of brainwave frequency bands in different colors, is an artistic representation. But the point that I draw down from that is to say the way that we're living and working is having a real effect at a neurological level. But that's also impacting how we feel and how we operate in the world in practice as well. And trying to bridge those gaps. And to give you an example of that, I can talk about how cognitive load in the workplace is often driven by this combination of the complexity of the tasks that we need to engage with, the time pressure that we often feel like we're under, and being forced to switch between tasks as well. I mean, they're the fundamental pillars of the NASA TLX cognitive load model, essentially. So, if you're looking at what contributes to the demands of the task, those are three big factors. And so if I'm on stage, I'll sometimes I might get someone up to actually wear an Epoch X and simulate what that looks like in practice. So get them to do a complex mental task, put them under some time pressure, and then get them to switch between different types of tasks as well. And so you'll just see this kind of cascade of higher beta brainwave activity, and obviously I'm not measuring it at a really objective level, but you'll see this kind of this shift to these kind of bright red patterns. And for an audience who's relatively naive to that idea, it's engaging. But then we can start to go beyond that and say, why? Why are you constantly engaged with this super high level of demand, of complexity, and task switching during the day? And this is where you can start to have a bit of a deeper conversation. So I find one of the biggest challenges for many of us is still this feeling that we need to be visibly busy. So there's this notion of productivity theatre that you might have come across. If people feel this pressure to look busy, which means that they then can't focus on being productive. And one of the manifestations of this in our hybrid working world is this idea that we always need to be showing digital presence, whether that's kind of, online with some type of collaboration software, responding rapidly to the messages that we receive on multiple channels, whether that's email, chat, etc. But also, it's this idea that if we don't do that, then somehow we might be slacking. There's this assumption that we are, if we're working from home, we're out walking the dog instead of grinding away at the keyboard. And you can see this in some data. Microsoft have shared some pretty interesting data on this that looks at similar patterns around productivity theatre. So this kind of a bit of this need to be present, the trust gap that exists between leaders often and their teams. That actually often leaders struggle to believe that their hybrid teams in particular are being productive relative to the employee's perception of their productivity. And so as a result, we end up with this kind of always on continuously connected way of work. So then we can kind of transition from this kind of artistic representation of the brain's discussion about the neuroscience of stress and recovery, and then talk about why you might be doing this and what, most importantly, you can do about it. But that initial display is the hook, and unfortunately, it does seem that the way that we communicate in the online world, particularly on social media platforms, has now pervaded all kinds of communication. And it's almost as if every time we engage with someone, we need to start with a hook and then create the hold. And particularly, I see this, probably 80% of my work is speaking communication now. That if I look at how I now have to design a keynote, it is a continuous series of hooks and holds. Whereas maybe even 10, 15 years ago, when I first got into this space, it felt like there wasn't such a high demand to do that. The audience would engage with a longer train of thought without the continuous stimulation. And there's a whole other conversation about what that means in terms of our distracted minds. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of how I balance that the legitimate critique that am I just kind of doing what I criticize, which is put a bit of neuroscience kind of sprinkling onto a kind of plain old message. But I think there's some real legitimacy to it, and we can go deep on it in terms of what you can use those devices for. But also, I feel like it is a result of kind of the world that we live in terms of the need to capture attention if you want to deliver a message that you genuinely think can have a positive effect on people's lives.
So, just to be clear, I wasn't criticizing. I was just trying to give you space to explain how you could kind of use some of that to actually end up where you want to go when you're trying to explain some of the stuff. So you
you're welcome to criticize me, Tom. We know each other well enough now. I'm not going to be offended.
So then this brings me into an area that, or sort of like a thought process that I've blatantly stolen from you several times, with full attribution, of course, which is the every time, I promise, which is the idea of cognitive gears. And is that something that you still use? If yes, can you tell us a little bit about it? And then how, and if no, how do you think about it differently now? And then how do you use that framework to start to overcome some of those issues that you were just talking about?
Yeah. So it's so interesting. So I came up with this cognitive gears model 9 years ago, and it emerged from this idea, similar to as I was describing before, that knowledge work is abstract. How do we measure it? Or it emerged from the question. And because if you think about a sport like cycling, my background, you've got heart rate monitors, for example, probably one of the most fundamental measures of effort, physiological effort in that sport. Or you've got power meters as well. But if you take heart rate monitors, for example, which you might also use for running, you can quantify the intensity of your physical work very easily. And we'd often describe heart rate training zones. And we'll set aside all the kind of challenges and limitations of heart rate training zones. There's some utility there, because essentially you can measure a low intensity heart rate zone, like a gentle walk, up to a high intensity zone, like an all out effort. And so I started to ask the question, is there a way that we could think about the intensity of knowledge work and the type of work that we do and the outcomes that might be associated with that? And so I came up with cognitive gears, and cognitive gears is a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb. I know there are no gears in the brain. That's another criticism that I've had leveled at me. But anyway, but the way that I describe it is that in a similar way that you might think about low to high intensity heart rate zones, you can imagine that there are three cognitive gears. There's a low cognitive gear, and that's characterized by rest, recovery, reflection, pausing, letting your mind wander. At the other end of the spectrum, there's a high cognitive gear, decisive, focus work, sustained attention on your highest priority tasks. And then there's a middle cognitive gear, and that's characterized by busy work, switching between tasks, emails, meetings. And then I've kind of expanded the model since then, and I actually talk about sleep as the kind of foundation for those three gears. But if you were to think about those three gears and your waking time, I've asked this question to leaders and business people all over the world. I say, where do you spend most of your working day? And pretty much everyone says the same thing. 70% or more stuck in cognitive middle gear, feeling stressed, like they're on someone else's schedule, with very few opportunities for that sustained focus and never enough time for rest. And I've been talking about that for 9 years now, and I keep trying to talk about something else. But I mean, I'm speaking at a conference this week actually, called the Global Leadership Summit, and it's a massive conference. There's like 8,000 people in the audience. It's billed as the biggest leadership conference in the world. And I had a meeting with the organisers like about a year ago, talking about the content. And I had all these ideas because I've got a big body of work over the last 9 years. And I was kind of in this planning call, and I was talking about a few of these ideas. And it just became really clear that the thing that still really resonated was cognitive gear. And I don't know whether that says something about the challenges that we still experience in the workplace, or whether I'm just really bad at PR and marketing, and not many people have heard about it yet. And it's but the interesting thing is the way that I've expanded that thinking a lot. I mean, there's some really although it was a heuristic when I first developed it, you're probably familiar with some of this more recent research around the locus coeruleus and its role in secreting noradrenaline and moving us through almost kind of different kind of neural states of alertness, essentially, and that actually you can almost think of the locus coeruleus as the metaphorical gearbox for the gears. And actually, I think that we see this challenge, I think, in the workplace still, that we are not able to move between these states of alertness, which I would describe as cognitive gears, and these different types of work. So today you can think about cognitive gears really as this way of combining this notion of alertness with the types of work that we do. And I'll give you an example, if you just permit me to kind of continue my monologue in answer to your second question of how do we actually take this and operationalize it? Well, if we start off and we think about that cognitive middle gear, for example, I've worked with a lot of different organizations, and one of the things that I like to do is gather data from them. And I did this as part of my PhD research. I mentioned gather a bunch of data, psychological, physiological, behavioral. But I find that some of the most interesting behavioral data is that actually relates to how much are these people working. And so you can infer an awful lot, and you can find that a lot of outcomes originate from weekly working hours, but not just the time that you spend in the office, the time that you spend activated. And I remember there was someone who I worked with not that long ago. We gathered a bunch of data from their team, and it was clear that they were working long hours, about 60 hours per week. And yet they never felt like they had enough time to get their work done. I mean, that's so familiar to so many of us, isn't it? And very clear from the conversations we had, from looking at some of the other patterns, particularly their electronic working patterns, they were stuck in this cognitive middle gear. And there were really three challenges that they were experiencing. I'd sum them up as an overflowing email inbox, an overwhelming number of meetings, and they're completely overloaded with what you might describe as digital debt. And I found that there's many things that you can do, but for the purposes of this conversation, I was going to sum it up and say, what are the three super actions that you can use to tackle cognitive middle gear? The first one would actually be, I'd say, tame your email inbox, tackle the overwhelming number of meetings, and then trial some AI employee alliances. So I think there's huge potential there. And I think if you want to, I can kind of drill into what those mean. But I've basically got kind of three super actions for each of those three gears, which I think is some good data to suggest that they could make a really positive difference in terms of helping people to to sustain high performance and also perhaps create the space that might provide the time to reflect so that they don't get drawn into this triangular relapse pattern where they oscillate between burning out or checking out. And that seems to be certainly resonating with people and having a positive impact.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind drilling down into that a little bit, I think that would be really helpful. It would also perhaps we've got some listener questions, and maybe this dovetails into one of them, which is actually related to student studying routines and studying patterns. And I think students, especially as now the idea of a student has broadened out, people come as like a second career, or they're doing it alongside work or family commitments as they do it later in life. That's certainly the case for a lot of the students at University of Washington, where I work. So yeah, some tips on how to, I guess, mainly tackle the middle gear, but then also how can we then make sure that we're getting some time to get into high gear, which is obviously really critical both for studying as well as pretty much any job that most people listening might engage with.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to do that. And I think it makes a lot of sense to start with that middle gear, because the way I talk about the challenge of middle gear is that it sucks our time and our attention. And so if we can find a way to improve efficiency and rescue time, to reduce time in middle gear, even though we'll never eliminate it, we can then reinvest that time in other places, perhaps in that kind of focus period that the kind of the student who asked the question kind of alluded to. So, I mean, if we look at that first principle there for cognitive middle gear, which is about taming your email inbox. Now that is, we've got this really bad relationship with email. So we basically have fallen into the trap of treating email like instant messaging, because we've got a culture of false urgency around email. Email used to be this asynchronous communication tool, and we now basically treat it like chat. And there's data, it's a little bit old now, but it indicates that people interact with email within 6 seconds of receiving a message often. There's some other data that suggests that 84% of people keep their email inboxes open in the background at all times. So, there's all these stats, and whether or not they're absolutely true or not, I think we all empathize with it. We can feel it. So how do we tackle this culture of false urgency? How do we start to reclaim the asynchronicity that email was originally designed to offer? So I've come up with a way to approach that, and it's basically a 3-step plan. And it starts by rethinking these implicit promises that we make to respond to all our emails rapidly. So that rethinking is almost like a reframe. It's to say, actually, no, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm actually going to start to approach email as an asynchronous communication tool again. The second step related to that is to then start to batch your email use into blocks during the day, rather than checking email continually. Now, it depends on your workplace context, but I know some people who are able to block email into 3 batches during the day. Some people check email once a day. Some people checking it 5 times a day is a great start. But the point here is that you're deliberate and intentional rather than just checking email continually. The third step is perhaps the most important step, actually, and that's to reset expectations with colleagues, with customers, if that's your context, with peers, about this new approach. And one way you can do that is using email signatures. So simply, you can explain those new email checking times. I check my email between the hours of blah, 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 and communicate the urgent communication alternatives. So, for example, if your email is truly urgent, pick up the phone. Now, I know people do this. My challenge is, do you ever do it and stick to it? And when I see this work, it's actually when it's not an individual intervention. People commit to do it as a team.
Culture.
Yeah. And exactly. And people talk about organizational culture all the time, don't they? It's like, it's a buzzword, but fundamentally, I stole this from someone else. It's just the way we do things around here. And unless there's a collective effort to do things around here differently, nothing ever changes. So that's my kind of taming email inbox. The second one is tackling the overwhelming number of meetings. Again, in Microsoft, there's a treasure trove of data, and Microsoft publish public data about how people interact with Office 365, which gives you a really interesting global sample of what knowledge workers are doing. But with the appropriate permissions, if you can get your IT department on side, you can actually extract these data yourself in your organization. But there was some data published a couple of years ago that indicated the number of meeting invitations we receive has increased by 153%. It's probably still something around that, if not more. But the interesting thing for me is that you can use these data if you've got the appropriate permissions to see not only how many meeting invitations you receive, but who is setting the meetings. And it turns out that there is a dangerous type of worker lurking among us. And this type of worker is known as the meeting maker. So you may know a meeting maker, Tommy, and perhaps Josh, you've come across one as well. This is the person for whom no problem is too small, but it doesn't demand a meeting with at least 7 people to solve it. Whose greatest pleasure in life is setting another recurring meeting in your calendar. And anyway, you can identify these meeting makers. And there was this little kind of study published, very, very small, but they identified that 5% of people are responsible for generating 60% of meetings.
Wow.
And I don't know how generalizable that is, but my sense is it's probably, based on the people I talk to and the other data I've gathered in some other organizations, it's not far wrong. So what do you do? Well, one option is that you find these people and delete their calendar accounts and cut off their internet access. But that rarely gets approved. So
I know some people I would love to do that with.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great? But it's very, very difficult to get your approval for that action. So there's a simple process, and this was actually originally this process was developed by someone else, but I've kind of adapted it. And so essentially, what I do is I encourage people in their teams to implement a process. And again, I always encourage people to do this as an experiment, because the challenge is, if I'm delivering this in a keynote, a leader will hear me, they'll get back and they'll say, "Team, I've got a great idea." And the team goes, "Oh man, another great idea from this conference that the leader's been to." So I would say, look, frame it as an experiment, because you find that if you frame it as an experiment, the early adopters, the enthusiasts will go, "Brilliant, this sounds like fun." The cynics will say, "Great, we'll really see. I'll show them this doesn't work. I can deal with it for 4 weeks because of the pleasure of saying I told you so at the end of those 4 weeks." And then the people in the middle will just kind of go with the flow. So I say frame this as an experiment for 4 to 6 weeks. And the experiment I encourage people to do to tackle meeting makers is to implement a process where anyone who sets a meeting first has to answer 4 questions. The first question being, have I thought it through? So don't outsource thinking to other people before you decide some time to think for yourself. Really simple. Second, ask the question, do I need outside input to make progress? Very often, the information people are hunting for by trying to set a meeting is available in an internal document or an internet search or ChatGPT or whatever AI tool you use. Thirdly, if outside input is really required, does this require a real-time interaction? And this relates to the observation that I reckon 60% of the meetings that I've been part of, bit of precision bias there, Tommy, the 60% of the meetings that I've been part of, at least, probably could have been replaced with a single well-worded email. And I think we've all found that. Finally, if a meeting is truly required and needs to be a real-time interaction, what is the best communication tool? And this kind of relates to that asynchronicity of email again. This process of stepping back and saying, what are these tools for, and when are they best fitted to the outcome we're trying to optimize for? So, for example, there's often this default to set a virtual meeting, but if a real-time interaction is required, I say, well, is this the time to use chat? Is it just a question you can write in the chat rather than set the 15, 30, 60-minute meeting? Maybe, scary, pick up the phone. When does that happen? If you're in an office with someone, maybe you need to get up and walk over and see if that person happens to be available. And if that real-time interaction with a virtual or in-person meeting is truly required, so a more traditional meeting, whether that's virtual or in person, the final step is really, really important. And that's, I call it the 3 Ps. Be really clear about the purpose of the meeting. That means having a clear agenda set in advance. Second, be absolutely clear about the people who need to be invited. So that means everyone needs a clearly assigned role. Fear of missing out is not a valid reason. And finally, commit to being fully present. And again, I'm going to throw a bit of precision bias in here, but there was this interesting case study with a CEO. And it found that the CEO, again, it was Harvard Business Review's published case study, was able to reduce their time spent in meetings by 20% when they basically went through a training process to be more present. And there was another HBR article that gathered data from 76 companies, and they found that across teams, if you were able to reduce employees' time, if you were able to reduce employees' time spent in meetings by 20%, it actually reduced employee stress by 26% and improved productivity by 35%. So I really see that presence piece as an enabler of reducing time in meetings as well. So you combine those different factors, and what you've got is this shift towards quality over quantity in meetings. Essentially, that's the kind of the outcome if you really wanted to sum it up, and that can help you to tackle some of those meetings. The final step is the trialing the AI employee alliances, and I can come to that, but I'll give you guys a chance to kind of respond and see if you've got some thoughts and questions on that.
I was gonna say, I wasn't gonna follow up with the question. I was gonna say that I think I've become known as the meeting canceller. So I'm doing the Lord's work, trying
another important role, right? I was gonna say I was reminded. Do you know the Dave Barry quote about meetings? Dave Barry, the humorist. If you had to identify, I looked it up. If you had to identify in one word the reason why the human race has not achieved and will never achieve its full potential, that word would be meetings.
Yeah, that sounds about right, doesn't it?
Pretty great, yeah. Do you mind if I ask him something, Tommy? I was gonna get to the book because I want to give you a chance to talk about it before we run out of time. So I know that your book is coming out this week, right? Regenerative Performance, and two questions, I guess. One is kind of what was the motivation for writing that, and then how'd you choose that particular title? And then the other question, asking for a friend, but writing a book is a complex cognitive task that requires a good deal of cognitive endurance. And so, did your understanding of all these topics influence your own process for writing your book, either implicitly or explicitly? And is there anything that you did in that process that you might have think would be a little bit unusual that other writers might not think to do?
Yeah, and that's a good question. Good thing for me to reflect on as well. So, I mean, I think to your first question, like what was the genesis for the book and how did that kind of all emerge? Well, some of it was about just wanting to synthesize a lot of my thinking in this space as it's developed over the last few years, but in particular to maybe try and capture some of what shifted in my thinking. Because I co-wrote a book back in 2016 with a guy called Dr. Aki Hintzer, who Tommy and I both familiar with. And at that time, I was probably more in that hyper optimization camp, I would say. I was like, if you measure everything and figure out where you are, where you want to be, and build a plan to get there, it's all going to be fine, right? And but in the meantime, not only did I get older and maybe wiser if I'm lucky, I also got diagnosed with cancer. Wow. I had testicular cancer like a few years ago, and until then, I had been that kind of effort plus optimization equals peak performance guy. The algorithm from when I was a full-time racing cyclist was really deeply embedded. And it was a curious experience because I was flying around the world. Everything was going great on the surface. Behind the scenes, I probably was close to the limit. I was working really, really hard. And I probably would have kept going like that. But then, there was this morning that just shattered that carefully constructed reality. I was in the shower, found a lump, received this testicular cancer diagnosis, changed everything. And I went from like running at 1,000,000 miles an hour to suddenly finding myself sitting in a chair on a chemotherapy ward. We caught it early, thankfully, but I still needed chemo after surgery. And a really curious thing happened in that moment, because as I sat there in that chair, I was like, this is the first time that I've stopped in about 20 years. Scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I had time to reflect, because chemo makes you feel bad. I was so naive. I took my laptop in, and the first kind of few rounds, I was like, oh, this chemo thing. I don't know what the problem is. I'm just going to keep working inside on my laptop. And then, as it went on, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is just awful. So I just had to sit and think and try and stay hydrated. And I kind of realized, I couldn't keep going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. being always on. But I wasn't going to give up and check out. I was never going to be this guy who was like, I had cancer and now I'm going to go and like, buy a farm and like eat sheep and walk around fields and stuff. It's just not me. Farms are hard. I'm not saying that, but you know what I mean. What I'm getting at. And that was really the genesis of this thinking of saying like, how do we find this third way? And I kind of went back to what I'd learned really as an athlete and a coach working with these top performers. And when I reflected on those people who were really able to sustain performance long term and do it without burning out and without blowing up marriages and relationships along the way, which thankfully I hadn't done, but no one's immune from this stuff. And it was a real wake up call for me. I realized that, they were the masters at balancing effort and recovery. And really this idea of regenerative performance was born out of that. I didn't write about this in the book, but one of the ideas that kind of occurred to me during it actually relates to Formula One, sport that Tommy and I are very familiar with. We've done some work in as well. And you might be familiar with this notion of regenerative braking. And so when in a Formula One car, when they decelerate, they've got this bunch of systems actually, that are able to recover the energy from braking and then use it to make the car get faster, essentially further. But the amount of energy they recover over the average race could power a house for about a day and a half. The average house, it's absolutely immense. And one of the challenges is there's this mode of thinking, this always on mode of thinking, which sees like rest as a waste of time and pausing as a waste of time. And that experience of being forced to pause, actually, I realized through that I was growing. That actually, by stopping, there was value in that. And this is something I talked about, and I feel like a complete idiot because there's so much I'd like talk, written, but it almost took me to, sadly, get cancer and experience it for this to really go deep and just go from the head to the heart, if I'm honest. And so this idea of regenerative performance that helped us to avoid these extremes, but actually recognized that the sustained performance was about this balance of effort and recovery, and perhaps more so this balance of effort and renewal, and a reframing that recognizes that rest in particular is not a reward; it's what makes great work possible. But also looking at some of the drivers behind that. So you'll find that in the book, I tackle some of these challenges that lead us to burnout and checkout. So, for example, I start off by talking about morning routines. And how we've kind of put the idea of the morning routine on a pedestal and tackle some of the myths around that to hopefully help people find more freedom to start their day in a way that fits with them rather than being dragged into some over-optimized routine. And I look at the work day with the cognitive gears model that we talked about, and then look at how we wind down at the end of the day, because there's so much really compelling research around the importance of how we can experience a level of detachment from work, how we can restore ourselves, not necessarily doing nothing, sometimes doing something different to get more energy back, even though we're investing energy to do that. Looking at sleep, looking at nutrition, but also looking at our mindset and looking at some of the myths that have really pervaded self-improvement. One of the data points that I find quite interesting is that if you look at spending on self-improvement, it is at all-time highs. So you've got all the kind of market research companies spending on supplements, on saunas. Self-improvement investment is just rocketing. Yet levels of life satisfaction are nearing historic lows. What is going on? And I think that a lot of it is about these myths that success is a result of grinding more, that we just need more passion, that we just need more grit, and actually often that we need to do it alone. Where we can go back to one of the most enduring models in psychology, self-determination theory, and we've known for decades that this combination of a sense of autonomy, a connection with others, and then also competence, being able to feel able that we're able to make a difference, that we've got some skills and capabilities to really enact our ideas and be effective in the world. Those three factors, autonomy, competence, relatedness, really are the foundation for well-being and sustained performance. But very often they're eroded by our current ways of living and working, because we think that these protocols will give us a sense of autonomy, but often they end up controlling us. Going back to the heart rate variability in the wearables, you see the rise of orthosomnia, this obsession with perfect sleep, and suddenly the wearable isn't actually helping you sleep. It's actually controlling you and determining whether you feel good or bad. Competence. Initially you feel great trying to follow this protocol, but everywhere you look on social media, there's someone else who's doing better, and you just feel helpless. Like, I'm not getting it right. Competence is eroded. And again, relatedness. Sadly, I just look around in this space that we're in, this human performance space, and I just think there's just so many people that are put on pedestals that they seem to be living lives that are only sustainable if you live in complete isolation and self-obsession. And actually, we know the evidence is, again, really compelling that if you were to kind of look at risk factors, social isolation and loneliness kind of potentially overwhelms benefits that we might even get from things like physical activity. Right. So the book is really kind of a bit of a synthesis, and also hopefully an encouragement to people that we don't need to fall into these traps of burnout or check out, and that actually there is a third way, and hopefully it's an accessible, encouraging attempt to help people to discover a way of working, of living that feels more sustainable, that's joy-filled, that avoids some of these extremes that I think many of us see around us today.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. I'm very excited. My copy is going to arrive on Tuesday. I've pre-ordered it. Hopefully I'll get it the day it comes out. So I'm really excited to read it. Tell us a little bit more about where people can find out more about your work. I will say one thing, which is that whenever I go on your Instagram account, I'm always shocked by two things. One, by how good your content is, and two, by how few followers you have. So if you're listening to this and you have an Instagram account,
just explain why.
Yeah, no. Like, it's I know that Instagram is not your primary way of reaching people, but if people are on Instagram, they should definitely follow you because your content is fabulous. But where else can they find your stuff, and where can they find your book? And we'll link to all this stuff in the show notes.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, so please follow me on Instagram. I'm sure you'll find some value there, and it'll help my ego as well. But yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn as well, and so really welcome the opportunity to continue the conversation on that platform. My website, drjameshewitt.com. So drjameshewitt.com has got kind of blogs, more content that you can dig into. You can also find out about my speaking and that kind of thing that I do there, and see lots of videos on that. And contact me. Feel free to email me if you've got questions, comments. Really, it's conversations where we're digging into these topics that really bring this whole area to life. And then you can buy my book in good bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, direct from my publisher Amplify if you'd like to. And that's going to be live on August the 5th, available to pre-order before that. But any of those channels would welcome the opportunity to connect, and really curious to hear your reactions to our conversation today. Maybe you agree. I imagine there's some people that disagree, but whatever the case, it'd be great to hear those thoughts.
Yeah, it was a brilliant conversation. We have to have you back on to explore some of this stuff in more depth, and I can't wait literally to read the book. What I love is you've clearly done a huge amount of cognitive labor to distill and package all of these concepts that you care about and try to present them in the clearest and most effective form. And it's really underappreciated how important and how challenging that is. And the reason it's effective is because it helps to reduce the cognitive load on the listener, right? And all of that work that you done to do that is invisible, which is a big reason why you do what you do, right? Is because we don't appreciate what goes into that, and we undervalue it, and we undervalue how much work it takes. So thank you for doing all that work to make it easy for us to grasp all these super useful concepts. And that's why I can't wait to read the book, because I imagine it's just filled with that. So thanks for being here. Thanks for writing it. Yeah. All right. Well, anything else, Tommy?
No, this was great, James. Thank you so much for your time. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks you all for tuning in. All right. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.